In this video, I want to give a brief description of what I want you to do for this second project, the children's book illustration. Briefly, I want you to illustrate the cover of a new children's book. The story to be illustrated is a retelling of a classic fairy tale or children's story adapted to our contemporary place, time, and sensibility. I'll get into this in more detail in just a moment. I want you to complete this illustration, though, using traditional media and not digital media. Of all the uses of illustration, children's books is the place where traditional media is often seen. Soft watercolor illustrations is a bit of a children's book convention. The final illustration is to be 8 by 10 inches, although you can complete yours larger, but stay in that ratio. The final illustration is due week 8. I like to give a lot of time for this project because there's a lot of media exploration I would like you to do before you actually complete this. We'll talk more about media and techniques in a separate video. But first of all, let's talk about what a children's book illustration is meant to do. A children's book is a story. Another way to say a story is a narrative. A story is a kind of narrative. And the illustrations that accompany a story support that story's narrative elements. And what are those narrative elements? Well, the first that I like to consider is the setting. When telling a story, it's one of the very first things we often say, once upon a time in a land far away, for example. But the next narrative element that an illustration supports is the character. It's hard to have a story without a character. An illustration can bring those characters to life. The last narrative element that illustration helps to support is the situation of a story. By situation, I just mean the plotting of the story and what happens in sequence. Visual storytelling requires a lot of situational activity. To make that activity clear visually is extremely important. These three elements are necessary to some degree for every story, although of course some stories will emphasize one of these things over another. For example, Rainbow Bay is a children's book illustrated by Pascal Malelli, one of my illustration heroes, and I'm glad to say, a colleague in Capilano University's illustration and design program. In this book, the setting is the real focus, and Pascal's illustrations, with their expressive and bold brushwork, turn the setting into the star of the book. But more often than not, in narrative illustration, we see something like this. This is an illustration that I've done. And as you can see, I've taken all the elements of a classical narrative illustration, setting, character, and situation, and tried to elevate them all. Now, this is a story that I've written and illustrated. It's an adaptation of a classic fairy tale, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, about someone who comes to town with nefarious objectives. In the original story, The Pied Piper of Hamelin takes place in medieval Germany. I've taken the general idea and adapted it to a modern North American city. And this is essentially what I'm asking you to do. But how would you do that? One of the first things I want you to understand about children's stories is that it's filled with conventions. A children's story is like other literary genres. It has certain story expectations built into it. Another way of describing that is that there are tropes within children's stories. A trope is a literary term meaning a recurring idea. While it's highly desirable to be able to come up with a story that avoids conventions and tropes, we can also use them to our advantage, which is what I want you to do here. Let's take a look at a typical trope within classical fairy tales. The idea of a prince saving a princess from a dragon. In the classic hero myth, the young, brave prince slays the dragon in order to save the princess, and the young princess, passive, receives the heroic prince's blessing with a kiss, and all is well. The prince saving the princess from the dragon is the trope, and the convention is to have them fall in love at the end. But this trope gets revisited and adapted in this story, The Paper Bag Princess by Robert Munsch, illustrated by Michael Marchenko. In this story, we see the classic trope of the dragon destroying the castle, but this time, rather than carrying away the princess, the dragon carries away the prince. But the princess in this story isn't the passive victim waiting to be saved from stories past. Donning a dirty paper bag, she goes off to save her beloved Prince Ronald. Using her wit and charm, she's able to deceive the rather vain dragon into letting Prince Ronald go. But once she saves him, Ronald berates her for her messy hair and paper bag dress, which leads the paper bag princess to one of the most satisfying endings in children's literature. "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum." And they didn't get married after all. as she skips off into the sunset. I love how this story uses the tropes of classic children's fairy tales, but takes the conventions and turns them on their head. It's the same in this book, The Frog Prince Continued, written by John Sheska and illustrated by Steve Johnson. The Frog Prince is a classic European fairy tale about a prince who is turned into a frog by an evil witch, but is turned back into a prince by the kiss of a princess. However, in this story, we see what happens after that. The prince, no longer a frog, is unhappy and bored and wants to go back to being a frog. The story is a lot of fun, but the illustrations by Steve Johnson are a real lesson in visual storytelling. The characters' emotions are easily discerned, but we also see them reflected in the wilted roses and flowers. We also see the yearning for the lily pads and dragonflies of his frog past reflected in the decor. This is brilliant visual storytelling. John Sheska is also the author of this book, The Stinky Cheese Man, and other fairly stupid tales. Illustrated by Lane Smith, it has a number of short adaptations of classic fairy tales. For example, The Ugly Duckling, in which the ugly duckling, over the course of 4 pages, is revealed to be actually just a very really ugly duck, and not a swan after all. Now, where do I find classic stories and fairy tales? Let's go take a look at this project's brief on the Idea Refinery. Here on the Idea Refinery, you'll find the brief for this project. I'm going to scroll down here to the project brief, and just under the due date is this link here. The list of possible fairy tales is long, and that takes us to the Wikipedia page of fairy tales. If I scroll down, you begin to see almost every fairy tale and folk tale around the world is here. If I scroll down, you can see that there are a lot of different choices. I encourage you to explore this. All these stories have links to their origins. For example, the Grimm's fairy tales. If I open that, many of these stories are folk tales passed down from medieval Europe. They often contain simple morals, but are great for adapting to modern times. The last thing I want to mention is stories that I don't want you to adapt. For example, recent classics, like Where the Wild Things Are. These stories are still under copyright. Most works of art, including storybooks, take 95 years for the copyright to elapse. Sometimes the estates of artists will renew their copyrights, so not every classic story is available for adaptation. Another thing I don't want to see is anime or any proprietary characters. Not that I have anything against anime, but anime as an illustration style has been so defined by the manga comics and anime animation that we don't see it anywhere else. And as a result, I recommend that you don't do it for this project. Good luck!